By 1938, the Empire State Building was making almost exactly as much money selling $1 tickets to its own roof as it was collecting in rent from the tenants inside it. The tallest building in the world was, for practical purposes, being kept alive by tourists. The site had a false start before it even belonged to the men who built it. A firm called Bethlehem Engineering Corporation had planned a 25-story office building on the old Waldorf Astoria hotel site at 350 Fifth Avenue and could not raise the money. The land instead went to a new company, Empire State Incorporated, formed in late 1929 by John J. Raskob, a former General Motors and DuPont executive who had made a fortune helping invent consumer car financing. Raskob brought in Pierre S. DuPont and Coleman DuPont for capital, banker Louis G. Kaufman, and a lawyer named Ellis P. Earle. As the public face of the venture, they installed Al Smith, the former governor of New York and the Democratic Party's 1928 presidential nominee, as president. On August 30th, 1929, the New York Times ran the announcement on its front page. Smith would head a company to build the tallest building in the world. 2 months later, the stock market collapsed. Raskob hired architect William F. Lamb, and, according to the story Lamb himself told, handed him a pencil, stood it on its end, and asked Bill, "How high can you make it so that it won't fall down?" The answer became an 80-plus story tower designed specifically to beat the Chrysler Building, which was racing toward completion at the same time a few blocks away under a rival automobile fortune, Walter P. Chrysler's. Both projects kept their final heights secret as long as they could. Each side wary, the other would simply add a few more feet at the last minute. Raskob and Smith's team won that race comfortably. The Empire State Building opened taller by hundreds of feet, but height alone was never going to pay the mortgage. Money for the project came from a mortgage arranged through Metropolitan Life Insurance and personal capital from the syndicate, but the group still came up roughly $13.5 million short of what they needed. Kaufman solved it by creating a new financing vehicle, Chatham Phoenix Allied Corporation, which itself borrowed from Kaufman's own Chatham Phoenix Bank to buy the bonds that closed the gap, a piece of insider dealing that later drew federal scrutiny once regulators started picking through the wreckage of the banking system. Construction started March 17, 1930, 5 months after the crash, and moved at a pace nobody has matched since. Steel rising 4.5 stories a week at points, using a workforce that at times topped 3,400 men a day, cheap and plentiful because the Depression had emptied out every other job site in the city. The building topped out September 19, 1930, and opened May 1, 1931, 13 and a half months from groundbreaking, ahead of schedule, at a total cost of $40,948,900. 5 construction workers died building it, a real number, far short of the hundreds later urban legend would claim, but real all the same. At the ribbon cutting, Franklin D. Roosevelt, then governor of New York, called it a symbol of vision and faith. He did not mention that the building opened roughly 75% empty into a city that had just increased its total office inventory by 92% at the exact moment demand for office space was collapsing. The vacancy above the 41st floor was almost total. By 1933, 56 of its floors stood essentially empty, and management kept the lights burning in unrented offices at night so the building wouldn't look as hollow as it was from the street. New Yorkers had a name for it by then: the Empty State Building. In 1932, the owners staged a seance on the 82nd floor, trying to contact the ghost of Thomas Edison, hoping the publicity might shake loose a tenant or two. By 1935, the building was losing roughly $1 million a year, about $20 million today. and Raskob himself was putting his own money into the building to keep it solvent, something people close to him said he hated doing. MetLife, holding the mortgage, chose to help absorb the losses rather than foreclose on a half-empty tower in a real estate market with nowhere to sell it. What actually kept the Empire State Building out of default was not rent. It was the observatory. A ticket to the top cost $1 during the worst years of the Depression, about $20 in today's money, and the building's sudden fame sharpened considerably when a giant ape climbed it in the 1933 film King Kong, turned the deck into one of the most visited attractions in the country. Roughly 1 million people rode up in the observatory's first year, generating around $2 million. By 1938, that number had grown enough that observatory income and office rent income were roughly equal, meaning half the building's cash flow was coming from tourists paying $1 at a time, not from the corporate tenants the tower had been built to house. Occupancy did not meaningfully recover until the 1940s, and the building's owners did not post a real accounting profit until the early 1950s, roughly 2 decades after opening. The building survived worse than empty floors along the way. On July 28, 1945, in heavy fog, a B-25 bomber crashed into the tower's north face between the 78th and 80th floors, killing 14 people. An elevator operator named Betty Lou Oliver survived a fall of 75 stories inside her car when the cables gave way, a record that still stands. The building reopened within days. By then, the observatory had already carried the building through the years when nothing else could have. The men who had bet their fortunes on being the tallest building on Earth were bailed out in the end, not by the office tenants they had designed the tower for, but by strangers paying $1 to look at a view. In 1961, the original ownership group sold the building to a syndicate led by real estate figure Roger L. Stevens for $65 million, a group that included Harry B. Helmsley, Lawrence A. Wien, and Pierre DuPont III. Wien went on to run the building's ownership as a syndicate of small investors for decades. By the time of a 2013 restructuring, roughly 2,800 separate investors held a stake in the tower. That arrangement passed, by the late 1960s, into a management partnership between Helmsley Spear and Wien's own firm, and eventually into the hands of the Malkin family, Peter L. Malkin, and later his son, Anthony E. Malkin. In 2013, that syndicate of scattered small investors was folded into a new publicly traded company, Empire State Realty Trust, valued at roughly $5 billion across the Empire State Building and more than a dozen other Malkin-controlled properties. The observatory never stopped being the real business. In 2010, according to documents disclosed as part of that public offering, the deck generated roughly $60 million in profit, while the office space, at the time only about 2/3 leased, barely broke even. By 2017, nearly 3.9 million people a year were paying a combined $124 million for observatory tickets, a business bigger, dollar for dollar, than the office leases in a 2.2 million square foot tower. Nobody was ever punished for nearly bankrupting the tallest building in the world, because in the end, nobody needed to be. Al Smith, Raskob, and the DuPonts built an office tower during the worst possible economic collapse in American history, filled it with less than a quarter of the tenants they needed, and personally bled money into it for years to keep the mortgage current. History didn't hold that decision against them. It simply waited for millions of strangers, $1 at a time, to decide they wanted to ride an elevator to the top and look out and let that unplanned, uncounted revenue stream quietly cover for an ego-driven miscalculation that, on paper, should have ended in foreclosure. The building is still standing, obviously. It's still one of the most photographed towers on Earth, and by most academic estimates, its long-run rate of return has ended up roughly comparable to other major office towers built in the same era, a respectable outcome. Nobody watching it sit dark and half empty in 1935 would have predicted. Nearly a century after Al Smith cut the ribbon on a symbol of vision and faith, the same math from 1938 basically still holds. A huge share of what keeps the Empire State Building solvent has never come from the offices at all. It comes from people willing to pay for the view.